Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Clive Bates of Counterfactual Consulting. This afternoon we have this morning, depending on wherever you are, we have a great panel to discuss the transformation of the tobacco industry, strategy, competition, and tactics. I think it's one of the most important things in the entire marketplace is trying to imagine what the tobacco and maybe the vaping and other makers of low-risk products will look like and how they will evolve over the next 10 to 20 years. Will they be predators, pariahs, or will they be players? Will they be actually addressing the problem that they and their products have done so much to cause over the past few decades? We have a great panel today. I can see some of them. So Gizelle Baker, Vice President Global Scientific Engagement at PMI. Sharon Goodall, who is Group Head of MRTP, British American Tobacco, or BAT. Now, I think MRTP is code for making claims about safety based on the American FDA system. Ian Jones is with us, though invisible to me at the present time, who is R&D Principal Scientist at JTI. And then also we have Joe Murillo of JUUL, the insurgent upstart of the pack, who is Chief Regulatory Officer at JUUL Labs. Welcome to the panel. Now, I've asked everyone on the panel to say a few words about just a brief introductory remarks. Then we're going to go into discussion, and hopefully I'll get some questions from the audience if that is a thing at this conference. But we have plenty to discuss. So I'm going to start with Gizelle Baker of PMI. Gizelle, would you like to start with some opening remarks, please?
Yes. Hello. Thank you for having me. I am going to give a little brief background. I'm an epidemiologist, so I'm approaching this conversation more from the science behind that drives the transformation. And obviously, when we're talking about transformation in the tobacco industry, without science, we don't, and without technology and innovation, we don't have a transformation. We look in the past, it lived in a world where cigarettes, smoking, tobacco, and nicotine were inextricably linked. They were one and the same. You had tobacco made with, cigarettes made with tobacco lit on fire to release a nicotine-containing smoke. And in that smoke were the chemicals caused by the burning of the tobacco, which caused smoking-related diseases, which is where we started this journey from. Because when we talk about harm reduction and we talk about the transformation is really a movement away from the harms caused by smoking and combustible cigarettes. It's only through innovation that we've been able to separate these different things into the pieces. And I think what's happened is the innovation has separated the cigarette from the nicotine to an aerosol generated from heating versus burning. But it hasn't changed the language that we use, which really starts to hold up innovation because it's really confusing. In the past, when there was smoking and not smoking, we wanted to move everybody to cessation, away from cigarettes, away from smoking. But when you move them away from cigarettes and you move them away from smoking, you're also moving them away from nicotine and all of the other pieces, because like I said, they were inextricably linked. And now we're in a spot with innovation that has brought to new products, and these products are evolving quickly. They're getting to the point where we can deliver nicotine with substantially lower levels of toxicants, and consumers are actually switching to them, and the numbers continue to go up. The product space keeps expanding, and with that, even more smokers are switching away from cigarettes. But without changing the narrative, we've got ourselves into a spot where it's really hard. If we're trying to achieve cessation from what? Do we want people to quit smoking? Do we want smokers to stop using tobacco altogether? Do we need to get them completely away from nicotine? What is the end goal? And without this clarity in the minds of everybody, we have a ton of products that have the potential to have huge impacts on public health, because we're moving people away from the most harmful nicotine delivery product that there is to less harmful alternatives. But at the same time, in the public space, this is quite often talked about as a failure because people are still using tobacco, and all tobacco products are equally harmful, or they're still using nicotine, and nicotine is addictive. So I think from a scientific perspective, when you look at this, we have science around less harmful products. We have more products coming to the space, and we have people moving. But we really need to get to the spot where public health, the tobacco industry, and everybody can come together to maximize this potential of these products and drive even better innovation, because we have billions men and women out there that smoke and a lot of room, and we need to move. The faster we move, the faster we get people off of cigarettes, the less burden of disease that sits in the population.
Thank you, Gizelle. That's excellent. I suppose the question, we'll come back to this, but the question is, how sincere is this transformation? How deep and how fast? And where is its end state? Is it, as you say, lots of people using tobacco and nicotine, or should society be trying to eradicate nicotine from, from all nicotine use altogether? Is that the more desirable public end goal? Let's move on. We'll come back to that, of course. That was a rhetorical question. Let's move on to our, thank you for that. Let's move on to our next presentation. Let's have Sharon Goodall of BAT, see if there's any difference. Is there a cigarette paper between these two behemoths of the tobacco industry?
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you very much, Gizelle, for your perspectives on the transformation of the industry. And probably like yourself, just a little bit of context, I come from over 20 years of product development and scientific research in a couple of different industries, starting my life in cosmetics, moving into food, and then for the last 10 years, finding myself here in tobacco and nicotine. So that's kind of just for context and the lens that I come to this discussion into. And I guess for me, the key about transformation in the tobacco industry is it's still going on. It's evolving. And I think that's something that I have to have at the front and center of my mind, because our consumer needs are evolving, our regulation is evolving, and of course, innovation itself is evolving. So it's also trying to make sure I keep that projected mindset, learning from the past, but keep looking forward. So reflecting on a couple of comments around what drives innovation is going back to that core consumer need. That's what drives innovation. And looking beyond how the product is delivered, whether it's inhalation, whether it's ingestion, looking beyond sometimes even just the substrate itself, looking beyond tobacco, looking to nicotine, and even beyond that, because what is front and center is what is the experience the consumer is after, and how do we fill that need? So that's what, to me, drives innovation. And of course, the passion for it comes from the purpose, the tobacco harm reduction purpose. And you alluded to how sincere it is. I think, having worked in this industry for 10 years, and I feel like I've aged 30 and done some very significant 24/7s, I think it's very sincere, because you have that ultimate value set of tobacco harm reduction. Of course, there's also a corporate purpose statement, right? And I know for BATs, it's reduction of the health impact of our business. So when you combine that societal THR agenda with our corporate mission statement, that can drive and really accelerate the need for transformation. And the third ticket, the winning ticket in the recipe for transformation and acceleration thereof, is talent. I started in this industry 10 years ago into a team called Novel Devices that had 6 people in it. Today, we have 1,500 scientists and engineers around the globe working to accelerate our agenda in our tobacco harm reduction across our 3 product categories. So that's, for me, what drives innovation. I guess what's holding it back? We have a high bar as the predicate product, right? The consumer satisfaction levels of our cigarettes have been in place for many, many years, generations of. And therefore, we have a bridge to gap. But it's worth remembering we're still in the infancy of this maturity of the category, and we're closing that gap down as fast as we can and learning in situ from our consumers and putting that back into the innovation mindset. So I think for me, worth remembering, transformation is an evolution, it's an ongoing process. We need to accelerate where possible, but remaining rigorous in what we're doing because of that link to tobacco harm reduction. So that's my opening piece.
That's great, Sharon. Thank you very much. Just a couple of thoughts spinning off that. I wonder how much innovation, I mean, you talked about innovation being there to kind of meet the needs of consumers, but how much innovative effort or science and technology effort is now going in to meet the needs of regulators rather than consumers? Have the companies been diverted from this? And maybe a corollary to that, is there an entirely different side to the industry? Well, they don't really care that much about regulators, but they are giving the consumer what they want. And maybe should people like me in public health actually be quite pleased about that? But don't answer that now.
Because coming back to that point.
Let's come back to
I look forward to coming back to that.
Let's get back on that. The other thing, well, there's another point as well that came off your talk. You know, you talk about the high bar being the predicate product. You know, the cigarette is a very, almost exquisitely designed nicotine delivery system, apart from all the death and all that. A lot of people think actually we could tilt the scales a bit by making the cigarette worse rather than the vaping or heated tobacco products. In particular, the, if you like, regulatory innovation of removing nicotine from cigarettes to change that calculus for users. Should we perhaps come back to that one as well? If panel would like to think about that or address it on the next go. We will skip Dr. Kendilly because she's not actually part of this panel, and we'll move on to Ian Jones, please. Some comments from you, Ian, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Clive.
And Tobacco International.
Yep. Thank you, Clive, and thank you to the summit organisers for putting together this interesting event. Just very quickly, so my background is anatomical neuropharmacology. I spent quite a few years working in academia before joining the industry, where I'm now a principal scientist in R&D. In the spirit of the overall summit theme, I'm going to approach this panel discussion very much from the scientific perspective, because science is an important foundation, I think as Gizelle said, to the modern tobacco industry, touching on almost all parts of the value chain, from agronomy through to how we design the products, product stewardship, very important, and all the way through to how we assess the impact of using our products. And so science in all its guises continues to be, a vital cornerstone. And for me, it is transforming in line with the transformation of the industry, really in response to evolving consumer needs, as well, Clive, as you just said, to increasing and evolving regulatory and public health scrutiny. Reduced risk products is being, the great case in hand, really. The category itself is still developing. And if anyone was listening to the summit yesterday, you heard that many people will say that there's still important scientific questions we need to answer around reduced risk products, particularly things like the long-term effects of use. But what concerns me, though, is industry science and its perception is still very much viewed with suspicion in some quarters, which resulting, as you know, well, many will know, in restrictions on where we can present our science, either at conferences or in scientific journals. And that's not only science that's produced by the industry, but even science that's funded by the industry. And I say this is very worrying for me. And quite often such restrictions are justified by, let's say, past history. Quite often from decades ago, quite often from times before even I was born, and I'm quite old, at least my kids say I am. I would personally contend that the industry's moved on a long way since the days when the allegations about industry science are centred. And in certainly my humble opinion, the industry at the moment is producing some really excellent science, particularly around the area of reduced risk products. It's just that, I say, some, for whatever reasons, for their own reasons, don't want to hear it. I think that is a great shame, and is almost a disservice to the larger scientific community as well as consumers. And so, how do we go on from this? I know, Clive, you want to discuss this as part of the panelist debate. So I have some ideas and some thoughts about what we could do, but in essence, I think we just need to be bold. We shouldn't, let's say, restrict ourselves and just go back into our shells. We need to be out there, being bold, presenting our science, certainly putting it forward to review by our scientific peers, and getting it out there and explaining it not only to scientists, but explaining it also to the consumers, to the regulators, and all the other people that are interested in this area.
All right, Ian, thank you very much. I mean, you're flagging a problem that I think is even larger than just the research issue. I've just this minute been reviewing a paper in which the authors basically say harm reduction is an industry position, even though there are many public health people that support it. And kind of a priori, it must be wrong because the industry supports it and the industry was, is, and always will be terrible. So there's definitely something that has to be done to overcome that. I'm not one of those who will say that the industry has all turned into, Mary Poppins or something, and we now, we now have an entirely virtuous industry. It's driven by competition. But how do we separate and challenge malpractice where it happens, if it does? And good practice where it's going on, and I'm inclined to agree with you, there's a lot of very good science. How do we do that? And how does one create a receptive audience for it rather than people who are sort of almost in principle or worse, tactically closed to it? So we'll come back to that, but it's a good point to raise. I'm going to move now to our final panelist. He needs to switch on his mic, Joe Murillo, of the insurgent JUUL, who was started life, not necessarily him, but his company started life with the bold claim that it was going to end the tobacco industry, only to have a big chunk of it bought by the tobacco industry. How does a company like that has only one way to go? It's not going to start selling cigarettes, as far as I know, unless I'm badly briefed on the company. How does a company like that see the future, and what does full-on competition look like if you're at the helm of JUUL? Over to you, Joe, for your remarks. Oh, hello, Joe.
Thank you, Clive.
Great.
Yes, can you hear me?
Can hear
Thumbs
you now.
up
I think it was a momentary freeze there, so please go ahead.
Great. So thank you. And I do have a little bit of instability in the Wi-Fi, so apologies if I do freeze. Well, you quoted Mary Poppins, and Mary Poppins is practically perfect in every way, but none of us are in reality. And so how do we do this? First of all, we do this because consumers are driving us to it. The most important aspect of transformation is the consumer. The consumer is demanding different products. The smokers are demanding, requesting, doing everything they can to find new products. So that is what's driving innovation and competition, and that is a wonderful thing. There's been a rapid evolution in technology. In fact, we think about the cigarette as being something that is very low tech. In fact, it was very high tech at about 1913. And now, 100 years on, we have massive innovation, and under Moore's law, this innovation will continue to be exponential as the consumer drives it. So that's a good thing for transformation. The products are quite along as well. There's a lot of way to go and improvement to be happening. And the science is really improving tremendously. Think about the innovation with respect to biomarkers and determining things that can predict a better health outcome for smokers. And there's some improvement, I would dare say, some improvement in regulatory frameworks. While many of you may say, wow, what is the FDA doing right now? But think about what they weren't doing 20 years ago. There was no pathway to any sort of a regulated harm reduction associated path. Now, what is holding us back? Well, what's holding us back is, as you said, many anti-tobacco forces that have as much money as the behemoths that you referenced before. In fact, in many ways, they have more money than the behemoths you referenced before. And they're fighting the speakers and not the content. Rarely do I see in the last year or so a criticism of science. I see a criticism of speakers. Oh, they are a tobacco company, so they are inherently evil. Oh, they have a shareholder that is a tobacco company, so they are inherently evil. I don't like the way they speak, et cetera, et cetera. So it's fighting the speakers and not the science. There's also bad science. There are things that are called causal that happen after the thing that it caused. It makes absolutely no logical sense. I'm not a scientist, I'm a lawyer by training, but I do know logic, and you cannot have something caused by something that hasn't occurred yet. There are regulatory gaps, plenty of them, and countervailing effects when there are regulatory issues that are not handled properly with a consumer in mind. And there's massive consumer misunderstanding of relative risk, even not only consumers, but physicians. We still live in a world where the majority of physicians commonly interviewed will tell you that nicotine causes cancer, not smoking a carbon-induced product. So what do we need to do? We need to encourage consumers to keep doing what they're doing and to switch off cigarettes, which are still by far the most harmful product that one can imagine. We need more good science. We shouldn't give up on publishing science, although I agree with Ian, I won't belabor the point, that this idea, again, suppressing the speaker and not the science is very problematic. And don't give up on regulators. I know it could be frustrating, but we've been going at this for at least 25 years. In fact, the Institutes of Medicine issued the seminal paper, Clearing the Smoke, and that was only years ago. And in this context, this is not the end. It is the sort of end of the beginning, perhaps. Better communication with smokers and a problem-solving approach to the issues that hold us back. One of those issues, which is a quite serious issue, is underage use prevention. And no one mentioned that, but I think it's really important that we all work together to understand whether there are additional interventions that are appropriate while still maintaining access to smokers, not creating access for underage kids. So people say, is this the end of smoking? I think it will be. Whether it's industry or government, people have goals. 2025 smoke-free, 2030 smoke-free. So that is something that even our critics and those of us who are promoting these products have in common. And I think it is doable. There are 1 billion smokers across the world, actually more. So there's plenty of good work to be done, and I look forward to further discussion.
That's excellent, Joe. Thank you. A huge amount to unpack there. I suppose you probably have more faith in regulators than I do. I see the industry involved in innovation, and in many ways regulators involved in a kind of anti-innovation, you know, putting nicotine caps in, trying to limit PK, banning flavors, you know, restricting things that basically make these you know, make these products actually fly off the shelves and appeal to smokers. So really want to open up the discussion now, because I think I agree with the premise here that even if these products don't work for every smoker now, if you have another 10 years of innovation at the rate we've seen over the last 10, and maybe longer, we're going to have a pretty powerful alternative product offering to cigarettes. So I want to ask the panel, first big question really is, from an innovation point of view, what does good regulation look like compared, and what does bad regulation, what promotes, if you like, good innovation, and what would prevent good innovation, and maybe the converse of that, there are sometimes bad innovations. What kind of things cause those? I'm going to start with Gizelle for a reflection on. I'm going to pick on people at random. So Gizelle, do you have any thoughts on that? What does good regulation look like if you're in the, you know, if you're trying to, you know, generalize from the success of IQOS into more markets, into other products and so on?
I mean, I think the very first thing is if you take your number one objective of getting adult smokers to switch, they have to be aware that the product exists. They have to know what the product is and why it's different from a cigarette. And they need support. I mean, we're asking them to make a behavioral change. And I think we know from a lot of learnings from decades of cessation that behavioral changes are difficult and people need change, need motivation. They need repeated contact. So there needs to be this, and they need products that appeal to them and meet the needs of what they're seeking, which may be what keeps them to continue smoking. On the other side, we need to prevent youth from taking up these products. So we need to make sure we have some controls on the age limits of when they can buy it, and controls over marketing and these types of things that restrict the access to youth, but without interfering with the communication to the adult smoker. And I think these are the things that when you get the regulation right, when you make it proportionate to the risk, if these are significantly less harmful, we want the adult smokers to be moving away from cigarettes to them, and we need to create the regulatory environment that drives that. And with more people coming comes more innovation, but we also need the regulatory framework to make sure that the products are the words that are coming to my head are like safe and effective, but not safe in the sense of risk-free. But they have to have standards, and we have to be able to know what's in the product and what people are being exposed to, so that we know that we're actually achieving harm reduction. And when there's more people coming, better products and driving it forward, but we can't have regulation that prevents innovation from coming and leaves us where we are today. We need to incentivize people to continue to innovate for better. So to me, you're articulating one of the interesting regulatory dilemmas here. And there are basically two types of regulation. One that serves the interests of users or intended users of a product, consumer protection. The product is what it says it is. It does what it says it does. It doesn't burn you, scold you, poison you, electrocute you, or all of those things. So that's regulation focused on the consumer interest. But then there's another type of regulation, which is regulation that's focused on the non-user and unintended users, which would be in your formulation, children, maybe non-smokers, perhaps even former smokers. Now, what I hear in the industry is a lot of kind of magical thinking about this, that both of these things can sort of coexist and both can be equally effective. But that doesn't seem to be the case. We seem to find systems where one is dominant over the other. So I'm going to move on and put a question to Ian now, which is, how does one strike a balance between those two forms of regulation that are maybe in tension and come to a sort of acceptable compromise? And what sort of principles would underpin that?
I think you're absolutely correct, Clive. For me, it's, I usually talk about balances in terms of.
Everyone says that.
Yeah, how we balance the two perspectives. I mean, for me, the innovation, let's say the product-facing innovation. For me, what we need from regulator there is a sufficiently wide space in which we can innovate. Innovation should have boundaries, but that boundary should be wide enough to allow, let's say, productive, constructive, consumer-oriented innovation to occur. And some of those boundaries are, as you say, around preventing unintended use. So that is actually, for me, part of the boundaries to innovation. What concerns me is where the boundaries become so squeezed in that the space for innovation is really curtailed, and you almost get to a situation where the regulator himself is, let's say, the innovator or the product designer. You could argue to some extent, maybe in the RMC, the cigarette field, we're heading in that direction where we're being told what design you have, how you can design the packs, etc. So for me, unintended use is part of the boundary that you wrap around your innovation space. And you say it is, whether it's in the same regulation or whether it's in a related regulation, it's all part of it.
All right. I'm going to go to Joe now, because I think a lot of the second category of innovation is driven by concern for kids, children, teenagers, adolescents, call them what you will. All right. Joe, have we lost our minds about young people and risks? I mean, JUUL is accused single-handedly of causing a youth vaping epidemic in the United States. But are we just going mad about this? I mean, kids, adolescents are kind of in a transition to adulthood. They do things that adults do. They always have. They probably always will. We'd probably be worried if they didn't. They have other problems in their lives. They take drugs. They fight. They join gangs. They have mental health problems. Have we allowed the youth vaping problem to get out of proportion, and therefore the weight placed on regulation to prevent youth to be excessive at the expense of adults and, actually, for that matter, young people who smoke?
Well, I won't comment on whether we've lost our minds. Sometimes I think I may have lost my mind, but not for the purposes of this panel. I think that the youth tobacco use situation is a quite serious problem. And I think it is a problem that deserves significant attention and intervention. To Ian's point, it's all about balance. And the thing with balance is, if you get it wrong, you can just have a complete tilt. And so when things are so prohibited, you're actually encouraging the illegal aspect of it, or the underlying current, because consumers, whether they're adults or kids, are hard to stop. Certainly from an adult perspective, we have a tidal wave of people of smokers that want to switch, and they will not be stopped. And if we don't get it right, what they're going to do is they're going to go to the black market. And that is not just an empty sort of rhetorical prediction. That is what has happened with alcohol, with significant price increases or tax increases. We see people going to the streets and finding the products that they want. So it's all about balance. So I think that the youth issue is something that absolutely needs attention from an access and appeal perspective, but you have to get the balance right.
But you are right there in that markets have a tendency to innovate in response to regulation by responding to what consumers or producers would find excessive barriers. For example, in the United States, escaping the jurisdiction of FDA by switching to synthetic nicotine, or simply by putting products on the market that are illegal or outside that framework. There probably has to be some delicate balance here, not just between users and regulation for users and non-users, but also regulation for producers, so that the producers or the market doesn't just default from the regulatory system and go underground. Sharon, I wondered whether you would like to reflect. I mean, one interesting thing about this is how differently we approach the drug nicotine to other drugs, stimulants, caffeine, alcohol, and so on. We don't generally force makers of beer to show that they're appropriate for the protection of public health, or we don't generally try to stop sales of wine, beer, or whiskey if kids are using these products. Yet alcohol causes a lot of problems. Caffeine's probably quite dependence forming. A lot of people will insist on really having a coffee before they do any sort of work. Where does nicotine, if you take away all the harms, most of the harms associated with it by going to non-combustible versions, where does nicotine fit in this world of drugs, illegal, legal, stimulants, and so on? And how should we think about that for the long term? And does BAT meditate on that question at all?
No, exactly. And it's a really good question. And I think for me, it's about imagining a world where we can discuss nicotine in the same way as we discuss caffeine. I look forward to the day where 90% of my time is not spent on tobacco harm reduction as a discussion. And we've got relative risk to a place where we are then able to talk more about the need that we're meeting with consumers. Now, the key then is, what does it take to get to that imagined world where we are able to talk about nicotine in the same respect as we can caffeine? Now, of course, we need to continue to reduce the current associations that we have with nicotine. So whether that be changing the delivery format and driving our science much more around the substantiation of that kind of long-term risk and unknown risks. And once we can close that gap to a sufficient degree and we get critical mass behind that, then we'll be able to talk about nicotine beyond the tobacco harm reduction agenda. But of course, we've got a way to go on that. We've got to innovate both our products and, as you alluded to at the beginning of this session, the innovation in our scientific substantiation so that our science can maintain the same pace as our innovation. And then we can start to imagine a world where nicotine is a much more familiar and a more acceptable discussion topic.
You pick up an interesting point there, Sharon, I think, and I'm going to put this back to Ian first. Unknown risks play a large role in this debate, and there's an argument that people will make, I've seen it made recently, that this transformation that's going on in the industry is essentially a transformation from people addicted to a product that has known risks, cigarettes, to a product that has unknown risks, vaping products, heated products, pouches, and all the rest of it. How much weight is in it? What's behind this unknown risk thing? I mean, I don't think it's a convincing argument. People would say, well, it took us 50 years to discover the risks of smoking. It took, we could be subjecting future generations to a myriad of threats. Ian, is that argument right or wrong? And if it's wrong, what's wrong with it? How much is genuinely unknown, known unknowns or unknown unknowns? How much, given what we do know, can we be confident in these products? What does the science tell us about the big unknown future risk question? Okay, well, I think the situation around reduced risk products, tobacco and nicotine products, is really, it is the baggage of the past is causing a lot of this, let's say, knee-jerk reaction to, we need to know all the science, we need to know everything before we can judge whether consumers should have these products. It would be a very sad world indeed if that applied to everything we do, because we may as well wrap ourselves up in bubble wrap and hide in the corner of the room. I think that in such a dynamic, evolving category, there's always going to be questions, particularly as, let's say, new versions of heated tobacco products or, let's say, e-cigarettes evolve. You're always in, let's say, the new technologies always can almost reset the dial for that product back to zero. So I think you need to step back and actually look at the fundamental science that underpins the categories. The electronic cigarette category, heating a liquid containing nicotine, or heated tobacco, what is the science around just heating tobacco, what do we know, as opposed to product specific science. I think we need more category specific. And the science to date, is very promising, and this is why many people talk about the potential reduced risk of these products. I think that we know so much about the comparator, the cigarette, etc. I think many people are just, I won't say running scared, but they're just very nervous about acknowledging that another tobacco product or nicotine product could actually have a differential health risk compared to the cigarette. So I think it's a gut feeling many people have. It's probably ingrained in years of
public health announcements, etc. You may remember coming to nicotine in the UK decades ago. We had Nick O'Teen. It was a cartoon character who was responsible for the evils of cigarettes. So back in the 70s, it was drilled into people that nicotine is the bad constituent in cigarettes, not the tar. So for me, I really encourage and I really like to speak about the category. What do we know about the category? I think it was Joe mentioned predictive toxicological methods. So as much as we can predict on these. Have absolute certainty, it'll be decades in the future before that. And the products are evolving so fast. I say the clock keeps setting to zero. We have to have a level of certainty, a weight of evidence approach to it.
Yeah, I mean, the question is when can we be confident enough that there is a 1 to 2 orders of magnitude risk reduction? That to me seems to be the when do we know? We may not know everything, but when will we know enough or beyond reasonable doubt to be able to take a probabilistic approach to this with high confidence in a large individual risk reduction?
I think we're, from many aspects, we're almost at that stage.
Yeah.
Personally, based on the current technologies, who knows what will be, ideated and innovated in the future. But that is still not going to be sufficient to persuade all.
I mean, in my sort of infantile mental model of this, I imagine instead of a continuum of risk, I imagine 2 clusters, one of non-combustible products and one of combustible products, with variations within each of those clusters, but a large discontinuity and difference between them at the broad sort of category level. Do you think that's a reasonable way of thinking about it, instead of a lot of unknowns about where each product is within those clusters, but a really substantial difference between them? Is that a reasonable thing to think?
I mean, yes, I think that is, in essence, what I was trying to say, rather than, at the category level, so the cluster level. Yeah. I think, and this is where, things like standards, we heard about speak about standards earlier. I think this is where there is space for, good, strong standards, for example, to help define what product fit in that cluster. So we know that there are electronic cigarette standards being adopted. I think ISO is working on the heated tobacco standard that will define, what are the key criteria that makes a product fit in this cluster.
All right, I want to move on now to a discussion about industry science and where that goes. In my view, a lot of it looks to me, and not a particularly deep scientist, but looks very credible. It's been produced to convince regulators who are very skeptical and very specialized. And for product stewardship, companies have legal liabilities and don't want to end up killing their consumers. So there are good reasons why this science would be of high quality. Yet it attracts, not universal, but very widespread opprobrium. It's banned. Its producers, as you mentioned earlier, are banned. I want to turn to Gizelle now for a turn on this. What do you think? What new ideas are there? If you take the hostile environment that industry science faces, what kind of things could be done here to sort of change the game or extract more value from industry science, from the sort of quagmire of conflicts and reputational baggage from the past?
I think the first thing when you look at industry science, when you have a new product and it's not in the market, the only place it can come from is from the manufacturers. And this is standard and regulators understand it. But I think one of the big things that I find in the dialogue around industry science is bias. And they talk about bias. Well, everybody's biased. Everybody has their own view. But what we need to start moving the conversation to is, was the impact of bias on the study, on the interpretation of the results? And I think you start to see things where the data is public. People can dive into the data and look at it, but to sit back, not look at it, and just call it bias in industry data doesn't really move in the direction of science. Data should be questioned. People can be skeptical. We need to look at what was the impact of that bias, because there's bias in both directions. I think we can look at the science coming from the other side that's trying to prove the harms, and there's bias in that data too, but we don't seem to talk about bias being coming from the funding source, but bias coming from the industry, like it's the only place where bias exists in our world. And I think the other piece we're going forward, we need to change the dialogue, is regulators are the ones who could benefit the most from strong data to support their decision making and to justify their decision making, to hang their hats on. And there needs to be a conversation and a push to open up the research broader than just the industry, because it will not only serve them, it will serve public health as a whole. If everybody knows, good or bad, the details of what happens when people switch to these products, we can answer some of these questions once and for all. Maybe not focusing so much at the product level, but like Ian mentioned, at the category level. The same way we don't talk about which cigarette causes cancer, we talk about smoking causes cancer. Yeah. I don't hear many people going into the details of that. And when you talk about drugs, lots of times you're talking at the class level. And it's important to have data on your product to make sure it fits in the category. But when you're answering the big questions, when it comes to epidemiology, product and these types of things, and effectiveness of products, quite often, we do it in lots of other areas, it's answered at the category level in broad consortiums. And these don't really exist in the tobacco industry today. And the push for them can't come from the industry. It really does need to come from regulators and public health. Okay.
Sharon, I want to pick up a point made by Gizelle, which is, you're sort of head of MRTP, or head of risk claims at BAT. There's a lot of actors in the field who make risk claims about e-cigarettes, about heated tobacco products, about reduced risk products that to me look wild and baseless. Do you think the industry should do more to push back on those? Should it be a more active in the scientific dispute about these products as a protagonist, or will that just make everything worse because of who the industry is?
Good question. I think the industry needs to focus. I think it needs to focus on what it does well, which is really good science, and continue to get that science out and shared. There will always be operators outside of the core industries that track their own path, create their own claims. And I think it could be a distraction. And I think we need to keep to our core focus, which is the science that we do, sharing it, getting it out there in order to shape regulators who can then provide a higher level push than the industry to put some structure around what is and isn't said about these products. So I don't think it's worthwhile going after every single individual player. We've got to push higher, we've got to put the bar higher and have a higher level of discussion. Otherwise, it's a distraction on our core purpose.
I think one of the most interesting conflicts that is upcoming is when and if FDA determines that a range of these products are appropriate for the protection of public health. How will that conflict with the sort of WHO principle that there is a fundamental and irreconcilable conflict between the interests of the tobacco industry, makes some of these products, and public health policy? Those two things can't both be right. And I think what you're suggesting is that your credibility will come from making your case with regulators. Is that right?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that's where the time is better spent.
Okay, I'm going to sort of wrap. Well, actually, I wanted to just come back to this question that came up in the introductory remarks very briefly. I think I'll put this to Ian. You could tilt the playing field in favor of innovation and transformation and transition to e-cigarettes or non-combustible forms of nicotine by making the cigarette products worse, by removing the nicotine or putting constraints on them that made them less palatable, less interesting, less addictive, or whatever. What's the scope for that strategy? And why shouldn't we do that? Why shouldn't we, or are we already doing that? Or have we taken, should we be degrading more than we do already the value proposition of smoking at the product level, not just with tax and marketing restrictions, to try and make the value proposition of non-combustible products more appealing in relative terms?
I think the main concern I have with that approach, and you say that it is certainly being considered by some, is that you make the product less acceptable, less satisfying consumers. They will look elsewhere, and potentially in terms of cigarettes, they may look to the illicit market to get the products that they want. I think that for me, the transformation, almost consumer transformation or evolution is ongoing at the moment. I think it's happening in front of our eyes. And I think that it will, I won't say send a bad message, but I think it may entrench people in their views if you really try to accelerate it by making the product they're currently using less present. I just think that it will be a disaster, and you'll find people moving to illicit sources of the products they want to use, and many of those products, as we know, are manufactured under certainly not the standards by which the tobacco industry manufactures products.
All right, I think you might be onto something. I think in a world where you can make a political cause out of not taking a vaccine that will, save your life from a very, very nasty disease, the behavioral consequences of, if you like, degrading the value proposition of cigarettes, going to be pretty unpredictable. But I think it's an idea that should remain under consideration and possibly just as a threat if we don't make real progress. I'm going to wrap up now. I'd just like maybe just a couple of sentences really from each of you on your sort of parting shot, what you would like the audience to take away, and please keep this very brief because we're out of time. Ian, why don't you go first?
Okay, I mean, my parting shot is the industry is transforming, the science is transforming, and for me it is really the consumers and the choices consumers make that will determine the future of this industry.
Consumers are driving it. Gizelle?
I think, we're in a spot where we have the technology and the things to continue to innovate for better, to better meet the consumer's needs and to better deliver harm reduction products and expand them so that we can truly make cigarettes obsolete. And we need to do it in a way that helps people do it fast, minimizes the youth uptake, and it means it's going to take the entire industry, regulators, public health to come together and really own this cause and make it happen if we want to do it in the best possible way so everybody gets the outcomes they want.
We have the technology, but it's the context in which it's made available that will make the difference. Sharon?
Hi there. I think for me, it's one of frame of mind. I think we have to remain positive in an environment that becomes increasingly challenging because we have made giant leaps forward. And we must remember we can deliver products that meet consumer needs. We can deliver strong science that can help to shape good, pragmatic, scientifically founded regulation. So it's one of positivity for me.
It's a really good point. If you back in, say 2008 or something, the market as it is now would be unthinkable. The products as they are now would be unthinkable. So there has been an amazing amount of change, and perhaps we lose sight of that sometimes. And final word to Joe Murillo. Joe. Oh.
Thank you, Clive. I agree with what's been said. I would simply add a quote from John Adams, who said, "Facts are stubborn things." And so whether our science gets published or not, we have to do the science. The science will win the day ultimately, because the consumers will not be denied and the facts are in favor of harm reduction.
That's a great point. You can't actually argue with facts, with preferences, deep consumer preferences. I feel this is like tectonic plates shifting and you resist them at your peril. We're going to wind it up there. I want to thank everyone on the panel. Ian, Gizelle, Sharon, Joe, great discussion. Really appreciate your insights, and I'm sure the audience will too. And with that, we'll hand over to the next session, back to the control room.